The year 2026 did not begin with explosions, gunfire, or another tragic headline out of Africa. Instead, it began with something far more unusual, a quiet act of defiance. For decades, Africa has been spoken about, decided for, and punished without consultation. And nowhere has that imbalance been clearer than in immigration and visa policies. When borders close in the West, Africans are expected to accept it. When restrictions are imposed, African leaders are expected to remain silent. That silence has been the pattern until now. Since Donald Trump returned to office, his administration has aggressively expanded visa bans and restrictions, disproportionately targeting African nations. Students, business owners, tourists, ordinary people suddenly found themselves labeled as risks, shut out not because of individual actions, but because of where they were born. This is not new. African travelers have faced discrimination for decades. What is new is what happened next. In mid-December 2025, the United States released a new list of countries facing full or partial entry bans. This time, every nation in the Alliance of Sahel States, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger was included. No consultation, no dialogue, just a decision handed down. And for the first time in modern African diplomacy, the response was not silence. Instead of managing optics or hiding behind polite diplomatic language, these governments did something radically simple. They applied the same rules back. Equal treatment, equal restrictions, equal dignity, a principle known as reciprocity, but in Africa's case it felt more like a declaration: we are no longer begging to be treated as equals. This moment matters far beyond visas. It speaks to sovereignty, to memory, to a long history of imbalance that many assumed would never be challenged. So here is the question we must ask ourselves, especially those of us watching from the United States. What happens when Africa finally says no? And are we witnessing the beginning of a continent that no longer absorbs pressure but responds to it? If you believe this moment deserves serious attention, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe that truth matters more than headlines, subscribe, because these are the stories shaping Africa's future. The turning point came quietly buried inside a mid-December policy announcement that barely made headlines in Western media. In December 2025, the administration of Donald Trump released a new immigration proclamation dividing countries into two categories. One group faced partial restrictions. The other faced something far more severe: a complete ban on entry into the United States. What shocked many observers in Africa was not just the policy itself, but who appeared on the list. Every member of the Alliance of Sahel States, commonly known as the AES, was placed under the harshest category. That included Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, three nations already struggling with insecurity, economic pressure, and diplomatic isolation. The ban was sweeping. It did not distinguish between politicians and civilians, between risk and routine. Students with valid admission letters were affected. Business people traveling for contracts and negotiations were blocked. Tourists, academics, and cultural exchanges were frozen overnight. And crucially, this decision was made without consultation. No dialogue with Sahel governments, no bilateral meetings, no attempt to explain the criteria or provide a timeline for review. For African leaders, this was not just a visa issue. It was a statement of hierarchy, a reminder of how easily powerful nations can redraw the lines of movement, opportunity, and dignity for weaker states. Yet history tells us that this moment could have ended there. For decades, when similar restrictions were imposed, African governments often chose silence. Some avoided public comment. Others reframed the issue as temporary administrative measures. Many simply absorbed the humiliation, fearing economic or diplomatic retaliation if they pushed back. That was the expected response. But this time, the silence never came. Behind closed doors, discussions began immediately within the AES. Officials revisited diplomatic precedents, legal frameworks, and most importantly, past moments where resistance had worked. One such moment stood out. In October 2025, months before the latest ban, Mali had already faced a different kind of pressure from Washington. The United States introduced a $10,000 visa bond requirement for certain Malian travelers, a financial barrier so high it effectively discouraged movement altogether. Most countries accepted similar measures without protest. Mali did not. Instead, Bamako responded by imposing the same $10,000 visa bond on U.S. nationals seeking entry into Mali. The message was simple: if Malian citizens are treated as financial risks, then American citizens would be subject to identical scrutiny. What happened next surprised many. The U.S. quietly reversed the policy, but only for Mali. No press conference, no apology, just a quiet retreat. That episode became proof of something many African leaders had long doubted: reciprocity works. So when the December 2025 bans were announced, the calculation inside AES capitals changed. This was no longer about symbolic protest. It was about applying a method that had already forced Washington to reconsider once before. And this time, the stakes were higher. The bans affected 3 countries at once. They targeted a regional alliance, and they carried an unmistakable message: the Sahel was being treated not as a partner, but as a problem. By the final days of December, decisions had been made. The question was no longer whether to respond, but how firmly. What followed just hours before the new year would mark one of the most consequential diplomatic shifts Africa has seen in decades. The first response did not come wrapped in diplomatic language. It came as a decisive act. Within hours of the U.S. proclamation becoming public, Niger moved first. Quietly, firmly, and without hesitation, Niamey announced a total suspension of visa access for United States nationals entering the Niger Republic. There were no exemptions, no phased timelines, no ambiguity. It was in every sense a mirror. For the first time in modern Sahelian diplomacy, an African state had not waited to see how Washington would react. It did not call for emergency consultations. It did not ask for reconsideration. Niger simply applied the same rule back. That single decision shifted the entire atmosphere. What followed was not chaos, but coordination. On December 31, 2025, as the year closed, both Mali and Burkina Faso released official statements announcing their own responses under the principle of reciprocity. The wording was careful, legal, and unmistakably sovereign. Burkina Faso's foreign ministry stated that the government would apply equivalent visa measures to U.S. nationals in line with mutual respect, sovereign equality of states, and reciprocity in international relations. Mali's Ministry of Foreign Affairs echoed the same position, declaring that American citizens would now face the same conditions imposed on Malian citizens by the United States, effective immediately. No threats were made. No emotional language was used. But the message was unmistakable. This relationship is no longer one-sided. What made this moment extraordinary was not just the response itself, but what it refused to do. There was no attempt to soften the decision. No temporary review period. No exemptions quietly inserted after the announcement. This was not symbolic resistance. It was policy. For decades, African leaders had been conditioned to believe that pushing back against Washington would bring unbearable consequences: aid freezes, diplomatic isolation, economic pressure. That fear had shaped behavior. It explained silence. It justified restraint. But the Alliance of Sahel States was operating under a different calculation. The AES had already redefined its security partnerships. It had already accepted diplomatic pressure from Europe and North America. It had already absorbed criticism over sovereignty, military rule, and regional alignment. The visa bans were not an isolated event. They were part of a longer pattern. And this time, the alliance chose confrontation over accommodation. The escalation reached its emotional peak when observers realized something else: this was coordinated, but not coerced. No single country forced another's hand. Each state acted independently, yet in alignment, a rare display of regional coherence. For African audiences, the symbolism was powerful. For Western diplomats, it was unsettling. It meant that Africa was no longer responding country by country, weak point by weak point. It was responding as a bloc anchored by shared grievance and shared strategy. And for the United States, the message was clear: policies designed to isolate could now provoke consequences. This was no longer about visas. It was about dignity. It was about the end of quiet compliance. And it raised a question Washington could no longer avoid: what happens when African states stop absorbing pressure and start returning it. As the new year began, one thing was undeniable. Africa had crossed a line it had never crossed before, and there was no guarantee it would step back. When governments exchange visa restrictions, the language often sounds abstract: reciprocity, sovereignty, diplomatic balance. But the real consequences are not felt in press rooms or foreign ministries. They are felt by ordinary people quietly and immediately. For civilians across the Sahel, the U.S. visa bans landed like a door slamming shut without warning. Students who had spent years preparing applications suddenly saw their futures suspended. Small business owners with contracts and trade meetings scheduled months in advance were forced to cancel trips. Families with relatives abroad were left navigating uncertainty with no clear explanation, no appeal process, and no timeline. These were not security threats. They were lives placed on hold. That is why the responses from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger resonated so deeply at home. For many citizens, this was the first time their governments appeared to be defending their dignity, not just managing international optics. Politically, the implications were even more profound. For decades, African leaders had internalized an unwritten rule: do not escalate with Washington. Aid dependence, security cooperation, and international legitimacy were often cited as reasons for restraint. Challenging U.S. policy carried risks, real or perceived, and most governments chose compliance over confrontation. The Alliance of Sahel States broke that pattern. By choosing reciprocity, AES governments reframed the power dynamic. They rejected the assumption that sovereignty must be conditional, exercised only when approved by stronger nations. In doing so, they also sent a message to their own populations: your government is willing to absorb pressure to defend your status as equal citizens of the world. That message carries political weight. Inside the Sahel, public reaction was swift. Local media, civil society groups, and everyday citizens interpreted the move as a restoration of pride. Not nationalism in its aggressive form, but something quieter: the sense that African passports should not automatically come with humiliation attached. At the same time, the decision carried real risks. Reciprocity does not erase asymmetry. The United States has more leverage, more global mobility, more economic insulation. AES leaders understood that retaliation could affect tourism, investment, and diplomatic engagement. They accepted those risks deliberately. That acceptance itself marked a political shift. It suggested that legitimacy at home was now being weighed alongside approval abroad. That internal recalibration, valuing domestic dignity over external validation, may be the most significant consequence of all. Beyond the Sahel, the ripple effects were already visible. Other African governments watched closely, measuring public reaction, international fallout, and internal stability. Some saw cautionary lessons, others saw opportunity. The contrast was especially stark when compared to countries like Nigeria, where officials openly acknowledged the restrictions but argued that retaliation would be too costly. That argument may be pragmatic, but it also exposes a fundamental divide in how African states now define power. Is power the ability to avoid confrontation, or the willingness to endure it when necessary? The AES response suggests a new answer is emerging. Visa bans may eventually be revised. Policies may soften. Quiet negotiations may resume. But something irreversible has already occurred. African governments have discovered that silence is not the only option, and that resistance, even when imperfect, can reshape the conversation. The consequences of that realization will extend far beyond visas. From Washington's point of view, the visa bans were framed as routine policy, an extension of border control, security screening, and domestic political signaling. In official language, they were administrative decisions, not diplomatic statements. But outside the United States, they landed very differently. For many observers across Africa, Europe, and the Global South, the message was unmistakable: mobility is power, and power was being exercised unilaterally. Under Donald Trump, immigration has never been a technical issue alone. It has been political, symbolic, and often confrontational. His return to office revived a familiar pattern: hard borders, sharp rhetoric, and policies that prioritize domestic optics over international relationships. Africa, historically lacking leverage in such debates, has often absorbed the impact without response. What changed in late 2025 was not Washington's posture, but Africa's. From a U.S. strategic standpoint, the Sahel has long been viewed primarily through the lens of security, counterterrorism, instability, and containment. Visa restrictions fit comfortably into that framework. But the reciprocal response from the Alliance of Sahel States forced American policymakers to confront a new variable: agency. For the first time, visa policy triggered consequences rather than compliance. This complicates U.S. calculations. American citizens, diplomats, contractors, business representatives, and NGO workers operate across the Sahel. While the United States does not rely on African mobility in the same way African states rely on Western access, American presence in Africa is not incidental. It is strategic, economic, and resource-driven. Beyond Washington, global reactions revealed deeper fault lines. In Europe, where right-wing governments have pursued increasingly restrictive immigration policies, African reciprocity has been met with quiet concern. Many European states benefit from asymmetric travel arrangements, easy access to African markets, resources, and infrastructure, while African citizens face layers of bureaucratic barriers. The precedent set by AES threatens that imbalance. In the Global South, however, the reaction has been markedly different. Countries in Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East have watched the Sahel's response with interest, not because visas are unique, but because the principle is transferable. Trade, investment, military cooperation, aid conditionality, all operate on similar asymmetries. Reciprocity challenges the assumption that power only flows one way. For the United States, this moment poses an uncomfortable question. Is it prepared for partners who no longer accept unequal treatment as the cost of engagement? Or will Washington interpret resistance as hostility rather than negotiation? History suggests the answer matters. When Mali imposed a $10,000 visa bond earlier in 2025, the U.S. quietly reversed course. That precedent now looms large. It implies that pushback does not automatically close doors, sometimes it forces reconsideration. The world is watching closely, not because visas define the future of diplomacy, but because how the United States responds next will signal whether it recognizes Africa as a subordinate space or as a negotiating equal. And that distinction may shape global relations far beyond the Sahel. What we are witnessing is not simply a dispute over visas. It is a test, one that asks whether sovereignty still has meaning in a world where mobility, access, and opportunity are controlled by a few powerful states. For generations, Africa has been told to be patient, to be grateful, to accept unequal treatment as the price of participation in the global system. Borders closed, rules changed, dignity compromised, all absorbed quietly in the name of diplomacy. The Alliance of Sahel States chose a different path. By responding with reciprocity, these countries issued a warning that extends far beyond immigration policy. They reminded the world that sovereignty is not a ceremonial word reserved for speeches and flags. It is something that must be exercised or it disappears. This moment also carries a lesson for those watching from outside Africa, especially in the United States. Power does not only reside in strength, it resides in restraint, respect, and the ability to recognize when old assumptions no longer hold. The assumption that African nations will always absorb pressure without response is one of those ideas whose time may be ending. But let us be clear, reciprocity is not hostility. It is not a rejection of cooperation. It is not an attack on dialogue. It is a demand for balance. If powerful countries continue to impose policies that disproportionately restrict Africans while expecting open access to African land resources and markets, they should expect resistance to grow. Not everywhere. Not all at once. But steadily. And history teaches us what happens when imbalance is left unchallenged. From the era of forced extraction to modern systems of economic dependency, silence has never produced justice. Only negotiation backed by leverage ever has. Africa's leverage is often underestimated. Yet it is real. From gold and uranium to oil and gas, from strategic geography to emerging markets, the continent remains essential to global systems that cannot function in isolation. Western citizens travel to Africa for business, diplomacy, tourism, and influence just as Africans travel outward for education and opportunity. Movement has never been one-sided. That is why this moment matters. If African states normalize reciprocity calmly, legally, and collectively, future policies designed in distant capitals may no longer be written without consequence. So the question now belongs to you, the viewer. Do you believe African countries are right to push back against discriminatory visa policies? Do you think reciprocity is a step toward true sovereignty or a risk too great to take? And should more African nations follow the example set by the Sahel? Share your thoughts in the comments. These conversations matter more than ever. And if you believe that truth is more important than headlines, subscribe and stay with us, because the future of Africa will not be shaped in silence.